warm welcome to you to today's Power Lunch event here at the Regional Forum at DGAP Munich. Today on the topic of the Hungarian EU Council Presidency. My name is Maximilian Keller. I am the chairman of Junge DGAP and also member of the Munich Regional Forum. Still shortly after the Hungarian European elections, we have seen both the continuation of Fidesz party as the strongest party in the EU Parliament by Hungary, but also we have seen a revolutionary moment against the Viktor Orban's regime with a pretty new party who has received a lot of seats and a lot of attention in Hungarian media. It's my pleasure to moderate this event today, having two frequent contributors to DGAP's offering. Let me start with you two, Nguyen. You are the Deputy Director of the Jacques Delors Center at Heritage School of Governance and joining us today from Berlin. You are leading the center's think tank on, as your LinkedIn page says, all things towards EU institutions. And you're equipped with deep expertise in European affairs, having already been guest at our March Internationale Politik web talk and also contributing in our latest March-April edition on Internationale Politik, calling out the Hungary problem. Welcome to you, and thank you very much for being here today. Thank you. Secondly, I want to introduce you, András Rácz. You are Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Order and Governance in in Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. You are also joining us from Hungary today, from Budapest. You are also born Hungarian, and before joining DGAP, you have been former assistant professor at Pázmány Péter Catholic University, so also equipped with a deep expertise in Hungarian politics. Thanks for being here once more, András. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before I would like to give you the floor, let me give some introductory notes on the setting. First of all, please note that you will have the chance to, and you're invited to join us later for questions, but please note that the event is recorded and will be made available publicly. So in case you decide to join us, you will be part of this event. Secondly, we will have a short introduction by András and by Tu from the European, but also from the Hungarian perspective on the EU Council Presidency. And after the remarks, about 5-ish minutes, I will ask some questions and then I'll open up the floor for all of you. Please be invited to introduce yourself and ask your question yourself, but you can also make use of the chat and I'm happy to moderate it and have a look every now and then. Now, providing the floor, starting with you two, as already noted, you have already contributed to the Hungarian problem, to Viktor Orban's problem. And I would like to ask you provocatively, first of all, how do you comment on the EU elections? Also, probably you could provide us a little bit more background on what the presidency actually is, what we can also expect now from the Hungarian Council Presidency. And also, we've just heard the slogan by Hungary, "Will Hungary make Europe great again?" Probably you could give us your perspective from the European and from the Brussels side on what we can expect. Thank you very much for being here too.
Thank you very much for having me. I think this is a great time to talk about the Council Presidency of Hungary, which is to start next week. And let me preface what I say about the Council Presidency with the statement that we indeed have a Hungary problem in the EU, a very wide problem or horizontal problem that really sort of underlies the very question on the future of the EU, how to deal with member states and a member state that so fundamentally does not want to adhere to the rules that we have agreed in the beginning anymore. That being said, looking at the Council Presidency itself, I do think that some of the concerns might be exaggerated if we look at sort of the institutional role of the Council Presidency as such, and then the very specific timing of this Council Presidency, which falls immediately after the EU elections, as you said, Maximilian. So if we look at what council presidencies do in general, they basically perform 3 tasks. So it's a rotating presidency, which means that every 6 months a different member state takes over. Right now it is the Belgian presidency. After Hungary comes Poland. And what Hungary will do in the next 6 months, as of the 1st of July, is chairing the Council of the Ministers, so the different formats of where the national ministers sit. It means that Hungary will set the agenda, organize the work, and decide which topics will receive how much attention, how much time, and how much resources in the council. Secondly, they will act as a mediator, so an honest broker between the member states. Are supposed to foster compromises in the negotiations and act as neutrally and impartially as possible. And thirdly, they represent the council vis-à-vis the Commission and European Parliament in the negotiations in the legislative process. So this is the overarching role that council presidencies have. And as you can tell, they are very much focused on the legislative work of the EU Union. So council presidencies really play a role when it comes to adopting laws, to fostering negotiation, fostering compromises, and to leading the negotiations. And there are, I think, valid concerns that Hungary will not play the role of the honest broker or the mediator as well as should be expected from council presidencies, and that other member states do, and that they very much will use the presidency to forge their own interests and to not constructively sort of move forward the EU agenda. On the other hand, we also have to look at when this comes, and this sort of ties back to the European Parliament elections, which happened 2 weeks ago. So what we have now in this moment in time, when the Hungarian Council Presidency comes in, is really a time when not a lot of legislative works happen. So the European Parliament is still busy constituting themselves, organizing the political groups. The European Commission President will have to be nominated and elected. Then the European Commission has to be composed. So there's a lot of political momentum at the moment, a lot of institutional questions that need to be dealt with, the top jobs, who sits where, who takes over which jobs, which fractions, which political groups receive how much power, and so on and so forth. So traditionally, this first half year after EU elections are just not very dense in legislative works, right? Where the council presidency normally takes on a big role. So I think in terms of how much damage can the presidency really do, the Hungarian one, it is probably in this point in time as little as we would ever have it, right? So if we have Hungarian council presidency, I would say this is a lucky timing to have it, because it is in the half year where they can do the least damage, simply in terms of how they work and when it takes place. And also, if we look more on the content side, where does Hungary have the most disagreements with the other member states? I mean, it is in many, many areas, but also if we look specifically at foreign affairs, that is also the council that is not being chaired by Hungary, because there we have the High Representative on foreign affairs. Right? So I think institutionally, the council presidency works in very tight corset, but also in terms of timing, it is probably the best timing to have the Hungarian council presidency. Nonetheless, there is, of course, the problem that it is expected that Viktor Orban will use the council presidency to sort of as a stage for himself, to put himself on the international arena, to use the council presidency as a stage to advance his own views and its agenda, which is a problem given the attempts on the Hungarian side to often divide the European Union. So there is sort of this issue of how can the presidency be used more rhetorically rhetorically and on a wider picture to divide the EU. But I think practically, when it comes to the practical roles and the legislative role that the presidency will have, it is somewhat less of an issue. And on the motto, "Make Europe Great Again," I mean, it is a bit plump, to be frankly. It of course draws it is a replica of what we have seen in the US, and I think it says a lot also about where Hungary perhaps sees itself and where it aligns. And this is of course also in a period that leads up to the elections in the US in November. So the US elections will also fall within the Hungarian Council presidency. So I think it is quite telling in terms of where Hungary stands. But beyond that, I would also probably not put too much weight on it. It is a motto for a 6 months presidency that is problematic, but might not be able to do as much damage as is often feared, at least when it comes to the legislative work of the EU. And I will stop here for now.
Thank you very much, too, for the concise first overview and the European perspective. It sounds at least promising so far as that you've described this ramp-up phase until we can really keep the EU Council going. Thank you very much for that so far. And I would like to move to András, who is joining us from Budapest today. András, please be free already to give your thoughts on TU's assessment on how harmful or not it could become in the next 6 months. The EU Council's presidency starts at 1st of July. So you can still make a prognosis without already having the reality there. But what I would be very interested in to hear what the Hungarian aims and goals which have been announced already are from your perspective, what plans the Hungarian government has for the next half year. And also what I found particularly interesting is what impact Hungary's EU Council presidency could have on its position supporting the Ukraine. Thank you. The floor is yours, András.
Thank you, Maximilian. And all that in 5 minutes, right? First and foremost, please excuse me for my voice. It's not that I'm preparing for a Bonnie Tyler singing contest. It's just the air conditioning. Yet still, I'm trying my best. First and foremost, I'd like to wholeheartedly support what Tu said about the concerns related to the Hungarian EU presidency might well be exaggerated when it comes to the particular content of this presidency, both due to the timing and also to the general role of the presidency. Before we move to that, just literally two sentences on the domestic political changes in Hungary, or effects of the European Parliament elections. In the European Parliament elections, the winning party has still been Viktor Orban's Fidesz. They lost 2 mandates. So out of Hungary's 21 mandates, they secured 11. Previous term, they had 13. So they lost a bit, yet still they are the overall winners of the election. Besides, unlike in France and in Belgium, in Hungary, the European Parliament elections did not result indirectly in a change of government, meaning results of the European Parliament elections in the short run do not question or do not weaken the rule of Viktor Orban at home and also over Hungarian foreign policy. Yet still, when it comes to the EU presidency, the Hungarian administration is very well aware of all the concerns and considerations and limitations that Tu has already enumerated. Besides, despite the general and severe degradation of Hungarian diplomatic apparatus and the foreign ministry in general, the team working in Brussels is still composed of the best ones. Hungary has deployed its best diplomats to Brussels. Those people are well-trained, well-paid. Most of them earn much better money than Commission employees do. So that apparatus is entirely capable of managing a smooth and very functional presidency. And inside the Hungarian system, EU affairs are separated from the foreign ministry, which is good because the foreign ministry and personally Minister Peter Szijjártó has way too close relationship with the Russian Federation and with some particular segments of the Russian state apparatus. However, when it comes to the technical management of the presidency, it is done by a different team. It is not done by the foreign ministry, and this is actually good news. When it comes to the actual priorities, I put together just 2 slides, literally enumerating the 7 main priorities of the Hungarian presidency and adding what the national interest behind, how that national interest can be mapped out. So please allow me to share my screen. Now you are supposed to see a presentation, hopefully full screen. Does it work? Please nod. Very good. So
you can see it, yes.
Lovely.
Thank you.
So there are 7 priorities. The first one, top one, is to have put together a new European competitiveness deal, so to increase the general competitiveness of the European Union. This is kind of common wisdom. Who would not like to increase the competitiveness of the European Union? I mean, this is harmless, this is technical, and when it comes to the national interest behind, despite all the opening efforts towards Russia and China, 80% of Hungary's export still goes to the European Union. So it's an essential interest of Budapest to foster the competitiveness of the EU as a whole. The second priority is the one which may raise most concerns, because it's quite unusual, particularly from a small country, to put European defense on the agenda and as a number 2 priority, so reinforcing European defense. If one reads the presidency program, it enumerates the growing instability, the war in Ukraine, without mentioning Russia as an aggressor, fun fact. But if one goes deeper, there is an entirely rational Hungarian national interest or government interest behind fostering closer European defense, colleagues, to create market for Hungary's defense industry. Because since the mid-2010s, the subsequent Orban governments have massively invested into Hungarian defense industrial capabilities, way before the escalation in Ukraine. So by now, Hungary has been a country with a slightly oversized defense industry, particularly if one takes into account the yet ongoing the projects which are yet to be constructed. To give you a few examples, Germany's Rheinmetall has massively invested in Hungary, Turkish companies, British companies. Hungary is upgrading its ammunition production facilities by buying a high-tech Austrian company. There are a lot of such investments. So when Budapest speaks about reinforcing European defense, it's entirely national. It's not about kind of a double speak, weakening European defense in reality. Nothing like this. Create market for the defense industry that Hungary has. When it comes to the third point, consistent and merit-based enlargement policy, this is fairly clearly about Serbia and partially about Montenegro, because fostering Serbia's EU accession has long been a priority of Hungary's foreign policy. This has been an overarching priority of all the Orban governments and even the governments before Viktor Orban. So this is entirely in line with Hungary's long-term foreign policy interest. Plus, taking a look at Serbia, this is not something that would happen overnight. So this is a fairly cheap commitment because the chances of Hungary actually realizing Serbia's EU accession during the presidency is 0. Fun fact, the Croatian accession was finalized during the previous Hungarian EU presidency in 2011. So this is kind of a long-term priority to foster the EU accession of Western Balkans countries. Montenegro is also on the agenda. North Macedonia to a certain extent as well, particularly since the change of government. Meanwhile, and this goes to Maximilian's question about Ukraine, this wording like merit-based enlargement policy, this is a diplomatic way of saying that there should be no shortcuts, that there should be no special routes, special shortcuts for Ukraine. Ukraine should go through the same regular enlargement process like everybody else. So it's extremely unlikely that the Hungarian EU presidency would do anything particular to support Ukraine's EU accession. Moldova, unfortunately, is a collateral damage on this story. Moldova usually moves together with Ukraine and will move together with Ukraine also on the Hungarian agenda. This has been clarified by the Hungarian government to the Moldovan government in person. This I know for a fact. Moldovans are all right with that. They understand that this is the logic. That's it. When it comes to the other four priorities, similarly to the previous three ones, these are anti-rational. All can be originated back to Hungarian national priorities. Illegal migration has long been a story. Thematizing illegal migration has helped Orban to win the elections in 2018. And this anti-migration agenda has been a key priority for him ever since. So by putting this on the agenda, I mean, the problem is real. Hungary has been under major pressure of illegal migration coming from the south. The Hungarian government would like to get extra EU money for financing the costs of border policing, ideally without giving Frontex too much say into that. Because if there is too much Frontex presence on the border, then the major human rights violations could come to the sunlight, and this is not in the interest of the Hungarian government. So this migration-related thing, this is real, and this can be very much stemmed from the long-term priorities of the subsequent Orban governments. Shaping the future of cohesion policy, well, this is not a thing that a small presidency decides in 6 months' time. So this is, again, who would not like to reform the cohesion policy? Again, kind of a low-hanging fruit. The government interest here, with not much chance of realizing it, is to reshape cohesion policy in such a way that Hungary could regain access at least to some of the suspended EU money. Sixth priority, farmer-oriented EU agricultural policy. Dear colleagues, Hungary is still a country with a fairly large share of agriculture when it comes to national GDP. Roughly twice the EU average, some 3.7% last year. So it is in Hungary's essential interest to keep the current financing structures of the EU agricultural policy, particularly because major oligarchic players around the Hungarian government have invested at scale into the agriculture sector. And addressing demographic challenges, well, good luck. This is, again, not something that anybody solved in 6 months. This is purely about domestic communication. The Hungarian government at home has long positioned itself as a family-friendly country, as a country fostering demographic growth. They put it also into the president's agenda. Not much will happen on the front. So all in all, I'd like, again, to fully support what Tu said. There is not much to be concerned when it comes to the actual program of this presidency. This is not about undermining the EU. This is not about inflicting any kind of structural damage. This is about smoothly managing this 6 months, which is actually going to be somewhat shorter than 6 months because of the summer break and the winter break. So there is not much to be worried, except one thing when it comes to the Foreign Ministers' Council. And it's very important what Tu said here, that the EU High Representative can play a major role in chairing the Foreign Ministers' Council. Because Minister of Foreign Affairs Peter Szijjártó needs to be sidelined and marginalized to the extent maximum possible, because he has very, very strong ties to the Russians. So the more role the High Representative can take over from the Hungarian Foreign Minister when it comes chairing the Foreign Affairs Council, the better it is. But otherwise, this is going to be a functional, low-profile presidency. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much, András, for this concise overview. Before I'll kick off my first question, please be reminded, some of you are already using the chat. You can ask questions, and I will then shortly kick off the round for all of you. Before I do that, I would go back to Tu. I would be very much interested, because it has not been mentioned so far, how the Hungarian or the rule of law procedure against Hungary will now further complicate or even, be abdicated or be even eased. In the past, before we had the Tisza movement, so the Peter Magyar parliamentarists in the House, we had opposition forces who have been very helpful in supporting this rule of law procedure against Hungary. Now with the TISA movement, I think they both have the interest, so the Fidesz party and the TISA party, to get financial assistance and financial concessions to Hungary. So if you could comment on how the rule of law procedure is expected to be changed or continuing just as usual, that would be interesting. And what I also would find very interesting too is how much leeway Hungary actually has, provided that there is this 18-month strategic common agenda, which is set by the trias in the European institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the question. Rule of law is, of course, one of the big conflict points between Hungary and the EU, and I think we need to maybe separate two different procedures there. One is really the funds that are being blocked against Hungary still, and even there it's actually different procedures that are being used. One is the financial conditionality procedure, the new rule of law mechanism, conditionality mechanism, however you want to call it. And there's also still the funds from Next Generation EU, so the recovery fund, that are being frozen. And the other procedure that Hungary is still under now as the only member state, in fact, after it was stopped against Poland, is Article 7 procedure, which is the procedure under the treaties by which certain rights, membership rights, can be suspended against member states, including voting rights in the Council if they breach EU values consistently and persistently and gravely. I think that in terms of the Article 7 procedure, that is definitely, it will be one of the issues that will fall under the table. So in previous council presidencies, they would organize discussions in the council, debates in the council on sort of the progress in the member states on rule of law issues and also on Article 7. I think we can kind of expect the Hungarian council presidency to not put itself on the agenda to be discussed in terms of rule of law questions. When it comes to the funds that are still being frozen against Hungary, I think it is still about 20 billion euros at the moment. At the end of the day, that depends on the reforms that are being made in Hungary, right? So I think András can probably say a lot more than I when it comes to what reforms are now being discussed or are maybe or are sort of in the line in Hungary. But at the end of the day, the rule is that Hungary needs to do the reforms, and then the Commission decides whether or not they have adhered to the conditions and the requirements when it comes to rule of law, and then it is actually also the Council that needs to decide to unfreeze the money and at least the conditionality regulation. So I think, again, this maybe has a bit less to do with the Council presidency as such and a lot more to do with what happens on the ground in the country itself. I'm sorry, what was your second question again?
Whether the 18-month trias agreed strategic agenda for the EU Council presidency further limits the topics that we've already to some extent seen by András, but which might be further limited by the agenda that has been set in advance. Or to put easier, can Hungary just exchange the topics and the priorities, or do they have to stick to the previously agreed agenda?
Yes, so council presidencies always work in trios. So it's always 3 council presidencies that sort of agree on a longer-term plan to ensure that there's a certain consistency. Also in the European Union, not every 6 months there's sort of consistency change, the topics change, and so there's always a 1.5 year kind of agenda for the council presidencies, which is I mean, it is not a legally binding framework, right? It is sort of what the council presidencies agree on, what the member states agree on. It's the framework in which they work. It is normally relatively broad, and I think a lot can fit under. And I think in terms of priorities, we have now also seen what Hungary plans to do. That being said, of course, presidencies can adjust to whatever happens, right, in the half years that they take over. And we have seen this in the past. When COVID hit, of course, back in 2020, that changed the trajectory of the presidencies that took over then. When the war in Ukraine started, that changed the trajectories of the presidencies that held the office then. So I think that in terms of how flexible are they? Of course, there's room for maneuver. And of course, there's always the question, what are the external factors that also impact the priorities of the EU at that moment in time?
Thank you very much, too. I would go to András before we open up the floor. This event is on the topic of the Hungarian EU Council presidency, but I think we all have been very much surprised in the last year what happened on the ground. And you write in your June policy brief that the success of Peter Magyar's movement, or now party, is another incident which shows that there is a gradual decline of the Orban system. Now, the big question is this going to be a permanent one, or is it a temporary one? Last year, I have spent 1 week with a political delegation in Hungary, and I was surprised how much propaganda and media, so the institutions of the Hungarian society were very much controlled by the Fidesz movement on the local level, but also on the national level. And I think it's difficult, of course, to project, but to me, it was unforeseeable last year that there is such a big shift by the Hungarian people towards a more constructive EU dialogue and to a less autocratic regime. So if you could give us an update also about the domestic situation and what we can actually expect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First and foremost, one more thing to what Tu already started, the rule of law procedure. In the previous EU Parliament term, the Hungarian Liberal Party Momentum had 2 MEPs who really supported the rule of law procedure with information from the ground, Katalin Cseh and Anna Donat. They were basically the information source for every nitty-gritty detail, and they put all the resources, all the attention, and they had the field knowledge for helping the rule of law procedure. But this time, the Liberal Party Momentum did not make it to the European Parliament. So these 2 MEPs were kind of the engines or the information channel for the rule of law procedure. They are not there anymore. So this will probably weaken the rule of law procedure, I mean the efficiency of it, because 2 members of the European Parliament who had all the access, legitimacy, all that, and were really the engines of this process are gone. When it comes, this doesn't mean that the process would become blind. Of course, it will just become a bit more complicated. When it comes to the domestic political situation, Maximilian, it's entirely uncharted waters. It never happened in Central Europe that a party which was registered 2 months ago, led by a politician who worked for the ruling party yet 5 months ago, skyrockets, takes nearly 30% of the votes, and rocks the entire political landscape. We just don't know what is going to happen. There have been cases in Central Europe when newcomers made it to politics relatively quickly in a few years' time. But no one has ever done that in 2 months' time. So this is something that one can draw trajectories, but there are a lot of unknown unknowns as well, not only known unknowns. What can be predicted from the regime side? Next national elections are scheduled to take place in spring 2026, so slightly less than 2 years from now. See, technically speaking, the government has the constitutional supermajority to change the constitution in any way they please, literally. I mean, in the Hungarian political system, if you have constitutional supermajority, if tomorrow Viktor Orban decides that the country becomes a kingdom, the country becomes a kingdom, period. I mean, literally no checks and balances left anymore. But, so technically he could go for early elections in order to diffuse the Péter Magyar syndrome before it grows too large. But right now, this constitutional supermajority is very narrow. It's just one member of the parliament. So it's a weak majority. So right now, risking early election would probably result that Orban loses his constitutional supermajority, and this is not something he would like to do, particularly because the country can be governed only by the two-thirds majority, simply because of the overall degradation of the legislative system. So what's much more likely is that the government will do, and in the propaganda apparatus particularly, will do their best to discredit and disrupt, and if necessary, destroy Péter Magyar's movement, deter people from joining it, cut the financing, deter supporters, so to destroy it from the very core. We don't know how this is going to go. What is known for a fact that in the government apparatus, literally thousands of people are working on collecting compromising information on the Péter Magyar and members of his party. There are entire departments working on that, particularly in the Ministry of Propaganda. So this is very turbulent 2 years are coming with all the legislative changes which would serve the sole interest of making it impossible for Péter Magyar and the TISA party to rise any further. But again, this is uncharted waters. Never ever happened anything like this in the region. So we need to keep a close eye.
Okay, thank you very much, András. So now I would open the floor to you. If you want to ask a question, please quickly identify yourself, ask a short question, and as always, a question ends with a question mark. So if you already want to join us, please raise your hand now or just unmute yourself and activate your screen. If not, I would continue with the questions we've collected in the chat. And as long as there's no one wants to speak up, her or himself, I would go back to two. There is one question by Thomas Schneider asking, to what extent is Hungary during his presidency in a position to influence the European Commission's composition?
I think that's a very good question, but I would also say relatively limited. I mean, how it works is the European Commission president needs to be nominated by the European Council and then elected by the European Parliament, and then afterwards all of them, each member state basically suggests their commissioner, and yes, the council needs to sort of adopt the list, I think, but what will be important is whether or not the European Parliament will agree. So the European Parliament is an institution that conducts the hearings with each commissioner and questions them and scrutinizes them, and they need in the end to agree to the College of Commissioners, so both the Commission President and the College of Commissioners. So I would say the influence in this particular question is first of all on the side of the member states, of course, but also the European Parliament, and the question of how much scrutiny the European Parliament will exert on the nominees by the member states.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, too. And the second one I'd like to pose to the two of you, which is how far does Hungary plan a China component to the presidency? There has been allegedly a tourism event in Budapest. I don't know, András, whether you had the time for it, but probably you could both take the question. Thank you.
Thank you. First, almost as usual, I'd like to fully agree with what Tu said, that the Hungarian EU presidency has not much potential to really shape the composition or the setup of the Commission. They just simply don't have the only way they could theoretically do is to sabotage and slow down the process. But because the most important elements of the process are taking place in the parliament, the presidency cannot do much. I mean, they can do some communication about it, but nothing substantial. When it comes to the China component, another sector where Hungary has been massively investing and inviting Chinese investors is battery production for electric cars. This is something that Hungary perceives as a strategic asset. There are already more than 14 new Chinese battery production plants being built or getting built on Hungarian soil. So the EU plan to introduce some kind of protective customs against Chinese electric cars, this is very much against Hungary's interest. Therefore, I do not expect the Hungarian EU presidency to be particularly cooperative when it comes to this introducing these customs against Chinese electric cars. But again, the presidency is only 6 months. And what has not been said yet, it's very important from the perspective of the EU, I mean, as a system, as a whole, that after the Hungarian EU presidency directly comes Poland. And whatever the Hungarians misdeeds they do, or just don't do things, just sabotage things, just slow down things, the upcoming Polish presidency can put things right back on track. So again, there is not much need to worry. The Hungarian presidency will not be too cooperative when it comes to decrease China's influence, but otherwise, I think this is manageable.
Thank you very much. Trudy, you would want to add something to that, or has he captured it well?
Not to China, but I think the point on the Polish presidency is very important. I think the worry about the Hungarian presidency was much higher when there had still been the old government in Poland, because the fear was that we basically would have a still stand for a year if we had two consecutive presidencies that would not work constructively. But I fully agree that with the Polish government taking over the presidency after Hungary, we still need to see that this is 6 months. And the Belgian presidency is actually also very active in trying to get as many dossiers done as possible before their presidency ends next week, right? So I think also the proceeding and the council presidencies afterwards can limit much of the damage that could possibly be done.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, too. Another question in the round. Otherwise, I would go back to one topic which has been mentioning before. So, András, you said we don't know what we can expect from the Peter Magyar party. You also write that they're massively building up political personnel on the municipal level and on the lower level. I have been last year at the András University, where I see we have one guest joining, and we had a discussion whether Hungary is a part of the European Union 10 years from now, if Orban continues his way down there. And there were multiple persons who said, well, it's not so sure. So I would be interested in whether Hungary, which is quite dependent on the European Union, still would have the option of, I mean, there's no institutional framework for it, but still have the option to decide they really want to exit or not. And I would start with András, as you're already eager to answer this one.
See, any kind of a hook-sit, like a Hungarian exit from the European Union, dear colleagues, it would be an instant and immediate Armageddon. I mean, you know, these soups, you add the soup, you add the hot water, and then you have the Armageddon. This is how it would function. I mean, even the very raising of the agenda of starting the negotiations of exiting the European Union, this would result in the immediate and irreversible collapse of the Hungarian economy. I mean, because of the automotive industry, which is in the country, because of the single market, because of the transit route, because of all the hundreds of thousands of Hungarians migrating on daily basis, working in the neighboring countries. I mean, imagine that the border with Austria or the border with Slovakia suddenly becomes a Schengen border. with visas and everything. And the British case demonstrated how extremely complicated exit negotiations have become, even in case when a country, a relatively powerful country, decided to exit. And there is one more thing, a strategic consideration, which is somewhat hard to add any numerical values, but yet is still important. If one looks at Europe's map, if Hungary quits the Euro-Atlantic integration structures, both EU and particularly NATO, if Hungary quits NATO, it would mean that the alliance would lose any land connection between the western part and the eastern flank of the southeastern flank of the alliance. The Hungarian transit routes are of crucial importance. And no offense to the Croatia-Montenegro border, but that's a low-capacity route. So Hungary's exit from the Euro-Atlantic integration structures is very hard to imagine, also from the strategic perspective. The alliance needs the Hungarian transit routes, the capabilities, all the assets, and the same goes also for the EU trade and strategic interest. So I do not see Huxit happening anytime soon. Besides, all the oligarchs on whom the power of the Hungarian government is built upon, all the oligarchs would be massively against the Huxit. I myself had the opportunity to speak to some of these people privately or behind closed doors, and they all say to the question of Huxit that that would be insane, that would be suicide. So no, this will not happen.
Thank you very much.
Can I maybe add something on
Please.
On this particular question? Maybe 2 points. One point is there's also always the discussion of, can we throw Hungary out of the EU if they do not adhere to the rules that we have and breach the rules? And I think it's always maybe necessary to reiterate that is not possible, that there's no mechanism by which member states, in fact, can be excluded from the European Union, but that I also am never sure whether how desirable that of an idea it is, because at the end of the day, as András said, leaving the EU is so drastic and has such drastic consequences also for the citizens that I think we also always need to remember that excluding a member state from the European Union also means punishing the citizens of that country for a very, very long time in a very drastic manner. And more broadly speaking, the whole question of leaving the EU or the EU breaking apart, I think the danger at the moment that we're seeing in the European Union, also after even parliament elections and with the rightward shift that we are seeing both at the national level and at the European level, is less of one, are countries going to exit the EU? Are we going to see disintegration of the EU in terms of member states leaving the EU? And it's more of the question, how will these parties and these governments be able to exert influence in the EU within, how they will be able to change the European Union from within and sort of push their visions of what the European Union should be like from within the EU, from the European Parliament, from the Council, from the European Council. And it is not so much about let's abolish the EU. It's really about we want a different EU, want a EU that is more nationalistic, one that goes back to national competences, national sovereignty, that has different priorities, that does different things. So I think the question is really more, and not just a question, but the danger and the risk that we're facing in the next legislative term is in how far will these very different competing visions of what the EU should be like and where it should be headed and how it should be constructed will sort of play out against each other. And I think we're seeing a shift that is not necessarily one that is very progressive and geared towards more European integration, right? So I think Euroscepticism at this point in time is probably more about how can we change the EU towards what we want it to be like, less European and less about should we leave the EU.
Okay, thank you very much, too. I bounce it back immediately to you. There's a question by Thomas Schneider asking whether Mr. Orban could visit China as in his role as EU Council Presidency, Prime Minister. what is actually the legacy? So I've never heard that the EU Council President is kind of traveling on behalf of the EU Council Presidency, but it could only be my ignorance of not having observed it. So probably you could please give us an idea about what how visits or state visits actually look like, and then to András, do you think it's realistic that you will travel to China? Thank you.
I'm not qualified to say from the institutional perspective. On the Hungarian side, there is a willingness to get Mr. Orban invited to Beijing as soon as possible. And from the perspective of, well, trolling, this would look nice. But the Chinese play is not about Hungary. The Chinese play is about the EU. So inviting the confrontational EU presidency would probably not foster China's position vis-a-vis the EU as a whole. So if I were the Chinese leadership, I would invite Mr. Orban somewhat later than the actual EU presidency as a form of escalation control. From the Chinese side, there is no need for trolling. It's actually quite the opposite. They would need a constructive dialogue. And getting Orban invited would have probably a toxic effect if this takes place during the Hungarian EU presidency.
I think in terms of from the institutional side, normally the Council Presidency does not have a role out like an external representation role. That is for the European Commission President to do, or the High Representative, or the European Council President. I mean, there's a lot of presidents. In the European Union, it is so the Council, but the Council Presidency itself is really more internally. That being said, of course, it is possible for Viktor Orban to exploit that role, right, and put himself on the international stage and to say, I had the Council Presidency, even though also here it is probably important to say it is not Viktor Orban himself that takes over the Council Presidency. It's really the ministers of the different formation, right? The Hungarian president, Hungarian government. Viktor Orban himself sits in the European Council, which has a different president altogether. But yes, of course, I think we cannot discount the possibility of Council presidencies being exploited as a stage externally, but officially the Council Presidency does not play a role in external representation.
All right, thank you, András and Tu. And I was just reading that Christina Galash has 2 long questions. Probably you start with 1 long question and unmute yourself, and then we're happy to take you.
Thank you. My first then is question regarding the domestic politics. Regarding the unprecedented explosion of Magyar Péter, we have seen before it with Márki-Zay, who were also playing the anti-corruption rhythms, and he's also coming from the right. And this combination has limitation, let alone Magyar's credibility is questioned in my perspective, given that he exited Fidesz just a minimal time before the elections. So the timing is super suspicious for me. And yeah, basically he did not proclaim anything new that we didn't know before. Even the tape about with Varga Judit is, I think it's something that everybody suspected before. So now, how foreign EU politicians possibly perceive him? In my mind, there would be too many black spots about him to trust him at all. That he's actually, who is he? Where is he coming from? So there are too many black spots on that to trust such a person, despite that his results are tremendous. Thank you.
This was only one question, right?
It was one.
You had 2. It's easier if you ask both.
Oh, okay. But the other one is a different topic. That's why I would go. Okay. If I get it right, there are also third country investments into the Hungarian defense industry. What is their extent? It is considerably large, and they are to be supplying the EU as a whole, as it was the intention of the Hungarian government, as you pointed out. Would it not undermine the potential of the EU-level defense system as such, since third countries would be well aware what we are having? They would see our cards.
Thank you. Let me try to answer in reverse order. When it comes to the exact share of third country investors in the Hungarian defense sector, this is impossible to tell. The reason is that since 2011, regulations on the Hungarian defense sector and transparency have been radically changed. Since 2011, basically every information regarding the defense sector, literally everything, counts as classified, meaning it's very, very hard to conduct an informed debate about details of the defense sector, because simply we do not have the data. So the share, I cannot tell you. When it comes to third country investors, the only major non-EU investor in the Hungarian defense sector is Turkey through the Neural Machina. But Turkey is a NATO country and a reliable ally. And there have been several NATO countries using Turkish-made defense technology, Turkish-made weaponry, vehicles, sensors, all these things. So I do not see Turkey's role as a defense investor into an EU country as anything that could undermine the entire EU credibility. Also because what Turkey is producing is somewhat technologically of lower level than what most EU countries would tend to procure. So this is not really in the same league. So I'm not that much concerned about that. When it comes to the credibility of Péter Magyar, I share some of your concerns. Others I don't share that much, but this is not the forum to discuss it. The interesting element is, despite all the concerns you have voiced, and many of them are legitimate, a staggeringly high number of people voted for Péter Magyar. So apparently there is such a level of disillusionment in the Hungarian society regarding the traditional opposition and also the ruling party, that they are ready to vote for whoever represents an alternative. So, and this 30% share became institutionalized by making it to the European Parliament, by making it to the Budapest Assembly. This is a difference compared to the previous such candidate, Péter Márki-Zay, whom you mentioned. So that's why I said that this is entirely uncharted waters. A lot of things are just simply, we do not know it yet. Yet still, of course, I mean, some of your concerns, I 100% share. Thank you.
If there is no more questions from the audience, I can't see one more, then I would ask you about a very brief prognosis, 1 or 2 words. What does the Hungarian EU presidency look like in the next 6 months? I'll start with you too.
What will the Hungarian Council presidency look like in the next 6 months? I think a lot of noise, a lot of attention seeking, a lot of tara, but on legislative content damage, very little.
Okay, little damage and a lot of tara. Sounds nice. András, do you agree?
If I share a personal story, during the previous Hungarian EU presidency, I still worked for the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. We were part of the presidency team. The first time that Hungary ever had the EU presidency. And that was really a national level effort. The entire country worked together, government, opposition, to really get the presidency going, functioning well. It was unprecedented. And me, as kind of a young analyst, half diplomat, I was a very small fish in a very large pond. But there was kind of a national cohesion and consensus that this 6 months has to go impeccably. And wherever you went to negotiate in a hotel with a policeman, with whatever taxi company to get one delegation from point A to point B, everybody understood that, yes, this is a national project. We have to do it right. This widespread national consensus behind the presidency, I do not feel now. There is no such vibe, which was there 13 years ago. Yet still, on the other hand, 13 years ago, that was the first presidency, fairly uncharted waters for the Hungarian apparatus. This time, this apparatus is composed of serious, seasoned professionals. So I very much agree with two. It's kind of a trend. We tend to agree that, yes, there will be quite some noise, particularly if one is pervert enough to read Hungarian media. So there will be quite some noise, but the apparatus will do its best to conduct the presidency in a smooth and professional way. So there is not much need for getting too much worried. again, except of Peter Szijjártó, but that's a particular story.
Thank you, András. I did not dare to ask you for personal stories, but even better that you shared them. Very, very interesting. Thank you very much. Thanks to the two of you for your great ideas, your concise answers, your deep expertise on the topic. So thank you very much. I would like to applaud, but I can only react by a little clap on this. Thank you so much for joining us again. And also thank you, the participants, for asking questions and for being here, for taking the time for it. I hope you enjoyed the Power Lunch. Now, before you leave, I would like to make two announcements. First of all, I hope that a lot of us see each other on the Summer Festival, which will take part at this Thursday. And then also, I would like to hint on an event which will take place on 1st of July in the Regional Forum in Munich with Professor Angelika Niebler, who is the deputy head of the Christian Socialist Union, on the topic European elections. We will meet at the locality of Benno Schwarz at the Marstallstraße, and this is an event which has only been invited for the Munich Forum. But if you want to participate and if you're not in the Munich newsletter, then please reach out to Julia and her team via events@dgap.org. And we're very happy to confirm your participation there. So having done the homework now, I wish you all a great day. I hope you had a good afternoon break, and I hope we see each other soon. Thank you so much and all the best. Bye.